So most of us probably think of retirement homes, pensions, and like old age security as a pretty modern phenomenon. If you're anything like me, you've probably not thought much about it. But if pressed, maybe you'd imagine that elder care was just something that families did in the home in the pre-modern period. I certainly would have thought that. But it turns out that wasn't the only option available. And people had the same challenges that we have today when it comes to planning for old age. So some families just didn't have the resources to care for elderly relatives. Some got burnt out. Caregiver burnout was a real challenge. And of course, not everybody had children or children who lived nearby and could adjust their lives to caregiving. But old age comes to us all, if we're lucky. So it shouldn't be as surprising as I found it that pre-modern Europe had retirement homes and other mechanisms to support people in old age. So for today, I want to talk about one popular option available from the 12th to the 18th century, which was supplied first by monasteries and later hospitals. Stick with me to hear more. So we're talking today about elder care in the Middle Ages and early modern period. And specifically, I want to talk about a retirement option that was available to people. A corrodie. It's a weird word. I personally struggled to pronounce it or remember it. But a corrodie was kind of the medieval equivalent of somewhere in between a pension and a retirement home. So you would buy the corrodie, although sometimes they would be gifted by monasteries, and it entitled you to a comfortable old age in either a monastery or later a hospital. So most corrodies can also be thought of as kind of like a basket of goods, and the specifics were often detailed in the contract. They almost always included a set provision of food, often firewood, clothing, or maybe a small cash allowance. Laundry was another service that you could see provided, and there are even examples of provisions for stabling horses or grazing livestock, although that's not as common. And they provided a place to live, which depending on the situation could be a room or a bed, or it could be a house or a cottage where the person or couple could live separately but owned by the monastery. So to give you an idea of what this might look like, we can look at a 16th century example. In 1533, a couple named Ralph and Agnes Bagshaw paid Ford Abbey in Devon, in England, £20 for their corrodie. The corrodie consisted of the right to live at a house with a garden called the Lodge. They got a yearly cash allowance, and it also included a weekly allotment of a set amount of bread and a set amount of ale, and two daily meals of pottage with fish or meat, and that was specified in the contract. So pottage is kind of like a stew. And they specified that the pottage should be equal to the allowance of 2 monks per day for the couple. The bread and ale was also a specific amount, and most of their allowance was to be conventual quality, meaning the same quality as what the monks were given, while a smaller portion of it was a lower quality, so something probably more like what they gave their servants. So I think you can see from this some of the appeal of the corrodie. The couple not only had their financial needs met in the sense of a place to live and food and allowance, but they also had a lot of their household labor taken care of. By which I mean, they got their food cooked, their bread baked, and their firewood came cut and delivered. So all of this would really help a couple as they age into retirement. So there are some interesting things to dig into when it comes to elder care provisions, and especially corrodie in the medieval and early modern period. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. If you like this video, remember to like and subscribe, or just let me know in the comments. I really appreciate it, and I always like hearing from you guys. So it seems like the practice of corrodie started sometime in the 12th century. Before this, of course, there were other ways of providing for retirement, specifically things like pensions or annuities, and again, family care. Annuities being an amount of money that a wealthy employer would pay to someone until their death. Monasteries, from their earliest beginnings, served their local communities as hospitals, with beds and medical staff to care for the sick and injured. They also often would operate almshouses to take care of the poor, and they would offer hospitality to travelers and people generally in need. So they were already involved in elder care long before they started selling corrodie. And it's perhaps important to remember that they continued to operate charitably throughout the Middle Ages. So corrodies were for people who could afford them. But poorer old people could also receive support through the almshouses and the other charitable arms of the organization. But at some point in the 12th century, monasteries started this process of selling corrodies. And at first, these were very ad hoc. They would usually sell them at times when the monastery needed to raise money or was trying to get new pieces of land. But if that starts to sound a little bit iffy, selling retirement, well, people thought that at the time too. So one 12th century English archbishop named Hubert Walter, he called the practice simony, Now, simony is the sale or purchase of spiritual things, and it was something that was strictly forbidden and that the church cared a lot about. Another observer, speaking in 1268, complained that corrody defrauded the sick or poor, meaning that in selling these corrodies to people who could afford them, the monasteries were kind of taking those resources away from their hospitals and almshouses and service to the poor. But the practice didn't go away. And in fact, there's evidence of corrody from all over Europe, in Sweden and Norway and Poland, in England and the Low Countries, and Spain and Germany and some other places as well. In Protestant countries, after the Reformation of the mid-16th century-ish, the practice continued, but switched to being provided by hospitals, some of them still religious organizations, some run by cities or local governments. So one study found that in 1797, in 3 cities in the Low Countries, which happened to keep death records, 19% of people died in hospitals. While the majority of people were cared for and died at home, hospitals continued to provide this important alternative care option. So when I was growing up, my grandparents' next door neighbor was this guy named Bill, and he worked as an actuary. So his job, as I understand it, was to do math for the insurance company to kind of guess how long a specific person is going to live and how much they should be paying for their life insurance and other kinds of insurance. I don't really know. So nowadays, that's very complex math that goes into deciding how much the insurance company needs to charge ahead of time so that they make tons of money in the future. The fundamental challenge, though, is that neither the insurance company or the client know the future and how long they're going to live for, right? So the math was less sophisticated in the Middle Ages, but that fundamental awareness of the problem was very much in place. How much does the monastery have to charge up front to ensure they don't lose money in the long run when they can't know if a new client is going to live another 30 years or a couple of months?
£100 a year to their mother while she lives. Would that be more advisable?
It is better than parting with the 1,500 all at once.
But if she should live longer than 15 years, she'd be completely taken in. People always live forever when there is an annuity to be paid them.
So there's been this discussion going on between economic historians trying to answer this question. Were monasteries charging appropriate amounts for corrody? Were they making money or were they losing money in the long run? It's complicated, obviously, because like insurance companies today, they're charging in advance for future services and there's necessarily speculation involved. And so I'm sure case by case, there were situations where they lost money or came out ahead, obviously. There's actually a great quote from some hospital directors in Baden-Württemberg in Germany from the early modern period, which says what I've been trying to say, only better. So in their assessment of a new client, they note, "The man is a good age. Hopefully he will not live long," which I think sums up the economics of it. So there is an article from 2010 that uses actuarial math to argue that the monasteries did on the whole profit from this. I don't understand it. It's math. I must accept it. But I do want to notice that there are other ways to benefit beyond the purely financial. Some of the earliest recorded examples of corrodies were actually in situations where, rather than a fixed cash payment, the monasteries received land from the corrodian. And from the monastery's perspective, important to note, this was land back. Land that used to belong to the monastery but had been given or sold away. And interestingly, this was mostly in cases where they had sold land to the lesser gentry or free peasantry, this sort of middling, in-between group class of person. So, for example, in 1147, the abbot of Peterborough granted corrody to someone called Robert of Torpel, along with his 4 servants. And in exchange, Robert gave them, the monastery, a couple of properties called manors, which their predecessors, the monastery's predecessors, had granted to his ancestors back in 1087, so almost a century before. So generally, the church as an institution, and monasteries specifically, really cared about what they considered to be their land. Church officials did not like to sell or give away any part of their land. Many monasteries weren't actually allowed to sell land without approval from the bishop. And when they did, when they really had to, you see things like this, where for 100 years or more, they still think of these properties as theirs, that we have to get back. So this may have been a significant driver of some of these early corrodies. Regardless of that very precise actuarial math, that was it worth it question, well, in the 12th and 13th centuries, if this interpretation is correct, it was worth it to get their land back. So later corrodies moved towards cash. And much later, into the 15th and 16th centuries, we're going to start to see not only cash pricing, but like a tiered pricing with deluxe packages and value packages. And that takes us in to our next topic, wealth and social status in retirement. So we know that pre-modern Europe was this extremely hierarchical, stratified society. You knew your place. So of course this is going to be reflected in these corrodies, in retirement. We can see this right from the start. Remember Robert of Torpel and his 4 servants? So Robert was granted what they called monk's corrody, while his servants got knight's corrody. The word knight makes it sound good, but in this case it's not. We can see what this might mean from some other corrodies where they spell out the quality, and it has to do with the quality of the basket of goods. So agreements around food would often distinguish between conventual quality bread or monk's quality and common bread or small ale, which was the same but lower quality. That's probably what the servants were getting in their knight's corrody. But another interesting thing to notice about these medieval arrangements is the social status of most corrodians, the people taking the corrody. This was an elder care solution for neither the wealthiest of society nor the poorest, or to put it in more medieval terms, neither the highest nor the lowest orders. They're the socially middling, and I'm going to try really hard not to say middle class, but it's really hard because that's not really accurate to this time period. In fact, corrodians seem to have come from a few distinct places. Some of them, but probably not the majority, were, like Robert of Torpel, landowners, but kind of minor ones. So somewhere in that gray zone between a free landowning peasant and minor gentry. But we know that that group had another, probably more common retirement strategy, which involved aging in place. So people would make a deal with either their own child or with someone else who was going to buy or inherit the property, that they would take over the property but allow the aging owner to stay and be cared for until their death. It's a pretty common setup. But some, for whatever reason, still chose corrody. Another group who often took up the option of corrody were servants, especially king's servants. And when I say this, I don't mean the sort of lowest class menial servants. These were people like the stewards and ladies in waiting, who in class terms were kind of equal to those minor landowners, the lesser gentry. Actually, in 13th and 14th century England, this became a problem for the monasteries because they largely weren't getting paid for those spots. The kings were demanding it as a customary gift, but for some monasteries, these retired rural servants started to take up as much as half of their corrody spots. So you saw a lot of conflict around that in that time period. And finally, another group that we see strongly represented in these corrodies were monastic or cathedral servants. Again, not servants, not menial servants. We're talking about people like chaplains, teachers, and this one guy from 1529 who was the organ master and choir director at Tavistock Abbey, who also had the job of teaching 5 choir boys. So these are skilled positions, and corrody might be working to attract and keep these skilled workers. But it also worked to provide old age security for people in what are kind of non-traditional life paths, if you think about it. Like I've already mentioned that by far the more common thing to do was to stay with family. And the rhythms of agricultural life and village life had those structures in place to support the elderly in their homes. In towns and cities, artisans with small family businesses similarly would have family structures to support them in their retirement, and also guilds as a formal organization to step in if family failed. But that doesn't help someone who's made their life as an organ master, right? Or like an elite caregiver to royalty. They were a little bit outside of those more common structures, but they still got old and they still needed care. In early modern Europe, care of the sick and poor transitioned from being the responsibility of monasteries to that of hospitals. These hospitals ranged in size. The larger ones tended to have at least 3 separate but interrelated roles. They were a place for the acutely sick, like people with an illness or injury, a place for the long-term sick, which included the elderly, and a place for poor relief. And they also sold corrodies. So one hospital in Leiden in Holland sold 2 types of corrody. The first, more common, was the middle class kind of commensalen contract, which entitled the holder to a bed in the nursing hall, food and drink, personal care from a nurse called a mother, and medical care as needed. But they also sold a deluxe package, which they called the provenier's contract, which included all the above, but also entitled the holder to a private room or a small house on the hospital grounds. In 1612, this hospital had about 140 people on the commensalen contract, but spread out over 2 locations. By contrast, they sold less than 100 provenier's packages over a 134-year span between 1665 in 1799. But even for the middle class Commensalen, there was this clear social stratification in the hospital, because the hospital also provided beds, food, and clothing for the abject poor, people who had nowhere else to go. So this stratification could take the form of separate living facilities or gradations in the quality of food, clothing, and the level of care provided. Corrodies gave people without family support systems access to a dignified old age without a loss of social status. But it is worth noting that this was only made possible by preserving the markers of social stratification within the hospital walls. So in pre-modern Europe, corrody was never the most common old age strategy, and most people did spend their final years at home. But it became an important alternative for people who just didn't have those social networks or didn't want to rely on them. Maybe you had a bad relationship with your kids. Corrody arrangements give us this interesting glance into some aspects of medieval and early modern society that we might otherwise not know very much about. The limits of family support, for one. But we can also learn about the life cycles of people in that middling class of society, and especially those who pursued careers less amenable to family life. And we can learn about the strategies people were using to preserve their dignity and their quality of life into old age. It's just neat. I mean, there is more we could say for sure, but I think this is a good place to let off. I want to say thank you so much for listening. And if you want to know more about the function of monasteries in medieval society, check out our video on asceticism. Okay, take care. Bye. Talk to you soon.